All right, so today we're going to go back to Unit 4, Area Study 1, and we're going to actually start talking about this guy, who you hopefully know exactly who he is. He is Darwin, and you might have studied him in Year 10 Science. So Darwin is all about this process that we call natural selection and how natural selection changes the genetic diversity of a population and the genetic makeup of a population. So in the study design, big chunk of the study design, we're talking about the changes in genetic makeup of population. So the qualitative treatment that causes changing allele frequencies of population gene pool. All right, we've talked about mutation, so we're going straight to environmental selection pressures on phenotypes as the mechanism for natural selection. Gene flow and genetic drift, which are the bottleneck and founder effects. And the biological consequences of such changes in terms of increased or reduced genetic diversity. Okay, and then from this we're going to talk about the process of evolution through the action of mutations of different selection pressures on a fragmented population, subsequent to isolating mechanisms, which we call allopatric speciation. There's other kinds of speciations, by the way, but you only have to know about allopatric, which is handy because that's the simplest one. So what's a gene pool? So a gene pool is the complete set of genetic information carried by all the individuals that make up a population, and it's expressed as the frequency of all alleles present in a population. Okay, really important that you know words such as alleles here, because alleles mean the variety of genes within a population. Okay. So here we have the gene pool for dogs, okay, for the big population of dogs, I guess, in the world or in Australia, it doesn't matter where it is. So you can see all these little letters in the big circle represent all of the possible alleles that dogs can have, okay? If we were to center on, for example, these large breeds of dogs, obviously they're going to have alleles that are a little bit more similar, okay? But then if you were to then look at a specific individual dog, so this guy, it is going to have a specific group of alleles that is present in the whole population, but it obviously can't have all of the alleles in the whole population, okay? Really important, what we're going to be talking about is changing of alleles in the whole group, okay? Not in individuals. And that's a really important distinction that students cannot make. So, mutations are obviously a major factor in all of this, okay? Mutations actually give the opportunity for variation, okay? So due to changes to genetic material, offspring of a cross won't only be the mixture of paternal genes. You're not just the mixture of your mum and dad, but you're also a bit of new stuff, okay? And that new stuff, the new genetic material and new phenotypes come from mutations, okay? But mutations change individuals. And remember, we're talking about a species as a whole. And so a mutation alone cannot change a species. Let's talk about why. So for us to change a whole species, we need what's called environmental selection pressures, okay? And these are new phenotypes can be selected for or selected against by the specific environment, okay? So for example, we can have simple selection pressures like predators, okay? If you're slow, your slow phenotype is going to be eliminated by predators. Or you can have drought. If you can't hold on to water as well, you're going to die in case of drought, and that's going to select for individuals with better phenotypes. You can have diseases, same story. All right, and this leads to this process that we call natural selection, okay? And natural selection, it's a mechanism for gradual change in a species over time, and it came up by this guy Darwin, but also by a guy called Wallace, which we forget a lot about, which you don't have to know, but it's a little bit of a sad story if you're interested. And Darwin assumed the following when he was proposing natural selection, okay? The first thing he assumed is that a population has variations due to the random mutations in sexual reproduction, okay? And that's just simply, we have random mutation and we have sexual reproduction that's going to mix all those random mutation genes all to create new individuals. some of those variations in individuals, they're going to be favorable depending on the environment, depending on those environmental selection pressures. All right. Point number 3 is one that a lot of people forget about, but it's really important that more offspring are produced than survive. Okay, if it was the other way around, you'd have an extinction. Okay, and this gives the opportunity for having a large sample of individuals where we can have individuals that are different from each other, individuals that are better suited, that we can say that they fit better into their environment. Those that survive and reproduce are obviously going to have the favorable traits. They get to survive and reproduce because they survive, okay? And because of this, a population will change over time, okay? All of these points are relatively straightforward, but it's really important when you're answering questions regarding this, you answer these in this order, okay? It seems quite trivial, but if you actually turn around and say that over time a population of lions became faster and because of this they were able to better survive in their environment, that's wrong, okay? And the reason why that's wrong is because we have a population of lions where some were faster, some were slower. The faster ones got to survive and reproduce, and so over time the population changed. Okay, and it's really important that you get that order right. Okay. All right, let's have a look at natural selection in action in probably one of the most classic cases of natural selection. In England, before the Industrial Revolution, we had this guy here, and it's called the peppered moth. Okay, and the peppered moth, he lived on trees, okay? And as you can tell, peppered moths, when they were on these greyish trees that they had in the UK, they were pretty well camouflaged. And so if a bird came along, he couldn't see those peppered moths. He wasn't going to eat them, okay? Well, obviously he would eat them sometimes, but in general, they were well camouflaged. Every now and again, we'd have a random mutation where a peppered moth actually came out like this, where it had a darker tinge to its colouring. Very much a lot more obvious here, and because of this, bam, the bird eats the darker one. It's not as well camouflaged, okay? So natural selection is selecting for this lighter colouring of the trait. After the Industrial Revolution, though, the trees all became really darkened like this. They were really black, okay? And because of this, that light-coloured moth now is a lot easier to be seen, whilst the black one is a lot harder to be seen. What's going to happen here? If a bird comes along, you guessed it, the bird's going to be able to eat a lot more of the white, light-coloured peppered moths, okay? Over time, what's going to happen to the population, the dark ones are going to survive, get to reproduce, and over time the population became darker in colour, okay? And this is an actual observable thing that's happened, okay? What you have to be able to do, though, from this information is talk about what's the consequence of natural selection, okay? Natural selection means that the frequency of alleles, remember we talked about that at the start, within a population is going to have to change over time. So, for example, if we have the white peppered moths and we say that the white feature is dominant, okay? And so the different genotypes that will give you white is big A, and big A, little a. And the black peppered moths, we say that they're recessive in this case. Okay? And so the genotype, the only one that will give them is little a. How would the allele frequencies change in each scenario? Okay, let's talk about the white trees first. Okay, so in case of the white trees, most of the moths are either big A, or little a, big A, little a. So they're white. Okay. Fewer moths, random mutations, give us that little a, darker or black moth. Okay. So we have a high frequency of big A and a low frequency of little a. Okay, let's talk about black trees, and we're going to go a little bit more into depth about this in a second. So once the big trees became black, these guys that were really high over here, they became lower, right? They were eaten. And these guys were lower, they actually increased. Okay, so we now have a low frequency of little a and a low frequency of the big A and a high frequency of the little a allele, okay? In this case here, this number is going to trend to 0, okay? But in this case here, this doesn't, the little a, so doesn't go to 0, okay? And the reason why for this is if you think back into Year 11 genetics, okay, that little a is able to be carried in the heterozygous individual, all right? The big A, on the other hand, it always has to show up. If it's present, the big A has to show up. So in both of these cases, we have a white moth. But in this case here, as much as we have a white moth, we still have the available little a allele. Okay, and that's why recessive traits don't just disappear from a population, but dominant traits can disappear from a population. All right, now that we've talked about natural selection, evolution by natural selection, we do have to talk about some other ways in which a population allele frequency can change, and these are the chance events of genetic drift and also the effect of gene flow. So first, genetic drift. So when we have a really tiny population, I'm talking really, really tiny, less than 100 individuals, all right, the chance events can also have a really major effect on allele frequencies, okay? The first kind of chance events that we have is called the bottleneck effect, and that's a specific natural disaster or something comes in and really, really lowers the number of individuals in a population, okay? So here's the parent populations, the yellow and the blue, you can see it's pretty much 50% each, okay? Let's say a forest fire happened, all right, and this is a species of deer, okay? And only the blue individuals and only a couple of yellow are actually survive into the new population. But this new population produces the next generation of the population, and now we have a much higher proportion of blue in this one, okay? Founder effect looks much the same, all right, but the process is a little bit different. So here we have a natural disaster. Okay, we have something that drastically reduces the population. The founder effect, we don't have a reduction in the original population. We actually have what we call the founding individuals. So for example, if we have this original population, lots of variation in the color, but these founders go and found a new population. They move somewhere else and create a brand new population there. That population is going to be made up of the alleles of this original founding population. Okay, we're not going to have all this variation. Okay. And this obviously happens often when a specific group of individuals in a population has to, either they're forced or they, by choice, move somewhere else. And it doesn't happen only with humans, all right? For example, lions, once a pride gets a little bit too big, some younger of the male lions will actually move somewhere else and they'll actually start a new pride somewhere else. So let's look at two cases where we have genetic drift. I'll tell you about the first case first. So in the first case, the cheetahs, they had quite a large population in Africa at one point, but then after a while, the population went down, 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 and then we're not quite sure why, but some kind of either natural disaster or man-made hunting, for example, actually took that already small population of cheetahs and grossly reduced that population of cheetahs, okay? And we were literally left with only about 7 families of cheetahs left in Africa, Okay, today the population of cheetahs has recovered quite a bit, okay, and so now we're left with a decent sized population, but it's all made up of the original 7 families that made up that family, that population of cheetahs initially, okay. So these are the cheetahs. The other case here is the Mormons in the US. So if you don't know who the Mormons are, they're a religious group, all right, and their population actually came from the east of the US, all right, and they were all guided by this one guy, one religious person that they believed in, and they moved to the central United States, and it was just a small group of families that all believed in this, but once they moved over there, they actually were very isolated and they bred amongst themselves. And because of this internal breeding, all right, a recessive trait, which is the trait which gives individuals more than just 5 fingers, actually came up, and this recessive trait showed up, and it's actually a lot more common amongst this population of Mormons in central United States compared to the general population. So which case is which? Hopefully you identified that this is a bottleneck effect. And this is a founder effect. Cool. All right, now let's talk about gene flow really quick. So gene flow is all about migrations, okay? Migrations are really, really common across the world, across different species. So from when individuals from 2 very genetically and physically isolated populations actually go and travel in between them, all right, we're talking about the same species, all right, but just varieties within that same species, but we have a travel in between those. The populations, this results in a change in the allele frequencies in both populations, okay? Obviously the effect's going to be a lot bigger in smaller populations. So for example, in Polynesia, when the Europeans first came down, the island nations in Polynesia all had very small populations. Those Europeans came to Polynesia and crossbred with the Polynesians, and because of this we have a lot of European traits within in Polynesia, even though we don't have huge European populations, okay? So obviously, so here in this case, this lighter color beetle migrates to this greeny color beetle, all right? And then once it migrates in here, obviously now we have this. So let's say if this was a big A allele and this was a little a allele, okay? Whereas we only had the big A allele on the right-hand side and the little a on the left-hand side, now we have the big A on the left-hand side as well. And obviously, this guy here is going to mate, and so we're going to get an increase in the big A allele, especially if it is of any benefit over there. So this all raises the question of how do we define a species, right? If we're getting crossbreeding across populations like this, how do we define a species? And it's actually really hard because here we have 3 individuals of different species or not different species. So we have the grey wolf, the domestic dog, and the Australian dingo. But if you actually go into the deep of it, most scientists today believe that all 3 of these individuals actually fall within the same species, the Canis lupus, all right? But the grey wolf is a subspecies of Canis lupus lupus, the domestic dog is the Canis lupus familiaris, and the Australian dingo is the Canis lupus dingo, okay? And because of that, you can actually get crossbreeding in all of these breeds, okay? Obviously, you're not going to get a Chihuahua mating with a grey wolf, and that's where this question starts to arise. How do you define a species? And this question is going to be huge later on when we look at human evolution. All right, so before we talk, so now that we've sort of tried to define a species, let's talk about one of the ways that species form. So if we have 2 populations that can interbreed, and these are really geographically separated, so we're disrupting the gene flow between these populations, all right, and we have different environmental selection pressures in each of these populations, it's possible that these 2 populations of the same species eventually become 2 distinct species. So here we have this one population of beetles, All right, and this one population of beetles there might be a river that separated these two. Okay, and this river that's separating these two, for some reason, the top environment becomes a lot more rainy. All right, and the bottom one might become a lot more dry. All right, because of this, the rainy environment is going to select specific traits in this population. So a little bit of a darker coloration maybe, and the dry environment is going to select for specific traits in the bottom population, maybe a little bit of a lighter colored trait. If, for example, enough time passes and for some reason that river dries up, if these two populations can no longer interbreed, they are different species. All right, and that's why it's called allopatric, which is the physical separation of different species. So it's allopatric speciation. Speciation literally means becoming different species. Okay?